In the early 19th century, night travel was something people avoided whenever they could. The road after sunset belonged to darkness, cold, and uncertainty. Travelers stopped at inns, waited for morning, and trusted the rhythm of day more than the silence of night. Then the railway appeared. At first, it was seen as a daytime machine, loud, fast, almost unsettling. Trains were meant to move people quickly from one place to another, not to carry them through the night while they slept. The idea of spending the entire night in motion felt strange, even unnatural. Imagine standing on the platform for the first time, not in front of an ordinary means of transport, but before something entirely new. A long line of wooden cars waits quietly, steam drifting into the cold air. The locomotive breathes like a living creature, impatient, powerful, unfamiliar. You step closer. This train will not stop for the night. It will not rest at an inn or wait for daylight. Once it begins to move, it will carry you forward without asking whether you were ready for such a journey. People of that era felt a mixture of excitement and unease. There was wonder at the speed, the technology, the promise of reaching distant places faster than ever before. But there was also doubt. How could a human body endure the night in a moving wooden carriage? How could anyone sleep while the world rushed past in darkness? For centuries, sleep belonged to stillness. Beds did not move, walls did not tremble. The night was meant to be quiet. Now the railway challenged all of that. The first passengers who boarded night trains did not yet know what awaited them. They did not imagine the cold drafts, the stiff benches, the endless noise of wheels against iron rails. They only knew that they were about to cross the night in a way no generation before them ever had. This was the beginning of a new relationship between sleep and motion. A relationship that would take decades to understand, endure, and finally transform. And it all started here, on the platform, before the train moved, before the night learned how to travel. When the train finally began to move, the night felt different at once. Not darker, but unfamiliar. The familiar stillness of evening was replaced by vibration, sound, and constant motion. The world outside no longer rested. It slid past the windows, unseen, unheard, except for the rhythm beneath the floor. Early passenger cars were simple wooden boxes on wheels. They were never designed for sleep. Inside, long wooden benches ran along the walls, facing one another. No cushions, no privacy, just polished wood, already cold to the touch. As daylight faded, oil lamps were lit. Their weak yellow glow barely pushed back the darkness. Shadows trembled on the walls, moving with every turn of the wheels. Faces looked different in this light, tired, cautious, strangely distant. At first, people tried to remain upright. They sat properly, hands folded, coats buttoned tight. Conversation lingered, then slowly faded. One by one, voices grew quieter. Fatigue settled in. Sleeping, however, did not come easily. The benches were hard and unforgiving. Backs ached, legs grew numb, heads nodded forward, then snapped back awake. Every sudden jolt of the train pulled passengers out of shallow rest. Sleep arrived only in fragments, brief moments stolen between the sounds of iron and steam. Cold air crept in through the cracks between wooden boards. Even in mild weather, the night air felt sharper in motion. Passengers wrapped themselves in coats and shawls, pressing closer together without quite meaning to. There was no true silence. The wheels spoke constantly, a steady, relentless rhythm. For some, it was soothing. For others, unbearable. No one yet knew how to surrender to it. This first night on the rails was not romantic. It was uncertain, awkward, and exhausting, but it marked a quiet turning point. Humanity had begun to test something entirely new, the idea that rest might be possible even while the world refused to stand still. Not everyone slept, but everyone remembered. For most people of the 19th century, sleep had always required one thing above all else: stillness. A bed stood firmly on the ground. Walls did not sway. Floors did not tremble beneath the body. Rest belonged to places that did not move. The railway quietly challenged this belief. Passengers soon discovered that remaining awake through the entire night was harder than they expected. Fatigue overcame fear. Eyes closed without permission. Bodies searched instinctively for comfort, even where none truly existed. People began to adapt. Coats were folded into makeshift pillows. Hats were pressed against wooden walls to soften the impact of constant vibration. Shawls were wrapped tightly around shoulders and necks, not only for warmth, but for a sense of enclosure. Some leaned forward, elbows on knees, letting their heads rest in their hands. Others pressed themselves into corners, bracing against the motion. A few discovered that surrendering, allowing the body to move with the train instead of resisting it, brought brief, surprising moments of rest. Doctors of the era were uneasy about this new kind of sleep. Medical journals debated whether rest in a moving vehicle might damage the nerves or disturb the mind. Some warned that repeated nights on the railway could leave a person irritable, anxious, or unbalanced. Passengers, however, trusted experience more than theory. They noticed that the rhythm of the wheels created a pattern, not gentle, but predictable. Over time, the body learned to anticipate the movement. Muscles relaxed slightly. The mind stopped reacting to every sound. Sleep, when it came, was light and broken, but it was still sleep. In these early years, no one spoke yet of comfort. They spoke instead of endurance. A successful night was measured not by rest, but by survival without misery. Still, something had shifted. For the first time in history, people were learning to rest while traveling. Sleep was no longer tied completely to place. It could follow the traveler, however imperfectly. And once that idea existed, there was no turning back. Along with fatigue, another companion traveled through the night: fear. Early railways were new, experimental, and far from safe. Accidents were common enough to be discussed openly, and every passenger knew it. Rails could crack, bridges could fail, fires could start without warning. To fall asleep in such conditions required trust, and many were not ready for that. Wooden carriages were lit by oil lamps and heated, when heating existed at all, by small stoves or open flames. Smoke, sparks, and heat lived dangerously close to dry wood and heavy woolen clothing. A single mistake could turn a carriage into a trap. People worried about sleeping through disaster. What if the train derailed? What if fire broke out while everyone slept? What if help came too late? For this reason, many passengers chose not to sleep at all. They stayed awake, eyes half open, listening for changes in sound. The night passed slowly for them, marked by stops at dimly lit stations and the hiss of steam in the cold air. Others compromised. They allowed themselves short moments of rest, never sinking fully into sleep. Heads lifted at every unfamiliar noise. Dreams were shallow and uneasy, filled with sudden awakenings. Yet fear, like fatigue, could not win forever. Each journey completed without incident weakened the anxiety. Each safe arrival taught passengers that the train, while imperfect, was not an enemy. Trust grew not from confidence, but from repetition. Slowly, cautiously, people began to sleep longer. Fear did not disappear, but it learned to share space with exhaustion. And in that uneasy balance, the first true nights of railway sleep were born. As night travel became more common, passengers began to collect knowledge. Not official rules or printed instructions, but quiet wisdom passed from one traveler to another. Simple tricks that made the difference between misery and tolerable rest. The most important lesson was clear. Never board a night train without something soft. Those who could afford it brought real pillows from home, large, heavy ones filled with feathers. They were placed under the head, against the wall, or pressed between shoulder and wooden panel to soften the constant jolting. Shawls became essential. Women carried several, wrapping themselves tightly, creating makeshift padding and warmth. Men used coats the same way, folding them carefully, shaping comfort where none was provided. Some learned to position themselves strategically. Sitting near the corner of the carriage reduced movement. Leaning slightly sideways helped the body absorb the rhythm of the rails. The train could not be stopped, but it could be endured more wisely. Others developed personal rituals. A few minutes of reading by lamplight, a quiet look into the darkness outside the window, a deep breath taken in time with the wheels. These small acts helped signal to the body that rest, however imperfect, was allowed. Sleeping upright brought its own challenges. Heads fell forward, necks stiffened, mouths opened in unflattering surrender. More inventive passengers tied scarves or belts loosely around their heads and fastened them to luggage racks above, preventing sudden drops. It looked absurd, but it worked. None of this made the night comfortable, but it made it survivable. These small adaptations marked an important shift. People were no longer resisting the night train. They were learning to live with it, quietly, patiently, one uncomfortable journey at a time. Not every passenger experienced the night train in the same way. Even in discomfort, the railway reflected the social order of the 19th century. Comfort, space, and dignity were divided carefully by class. In third class, there was little room for illusion. Wooden benches, crowded carriages, dim light. People sat shoulder to shoulder, knees touching those across from them. Sleep happened wherever exhaustion allowed it. Some leaned against strangers, others folded themselves awkwardly, guarding small bundles of belongings. Privacy did not exist, and neither did silence. Here, sleep was communal. Bodies formed clusters for warmth. Modesty faded as fatigue took over. The night was endured together, without ceremony. Second class offered small mercies. Benches sometimes had thin padding. There was slightly more space between passengers, slightly better light. The people here, clerks, teachers, modest merchants, tried to preserve manners. Hats were removed, voices lowered, snoring was endured with quiet resentment. Sleep came more easily, but never deeply. First class was different, though not luxurious by modern standards. Seats were upholstered. Space allowed legs to stretch without conflict. Lamps burned brighter. Air felt cleaner. Travelers brought trunks filled with comforts, blankets, slippers, even dressing gowns. Some were accompanied by servants who prepared their space, arranged pillows, fetched warm drinks. Compared to third class, it felt almost civilized. And yet, even here, the night remained restless. The carriage still moved. The rails still struck iron beneath the floor. No class could escape the sound of travel itself. But these differences mattered. They shaped memory. For some, the night train became a story of hardship. For others, a mild inconvenience. For a few, the first hint that travel might someday become comfortable. Night trains were never silent. Even when voices faded and lamps were turned low, the carriage remained full of presence. Sound and scent filled the space, becoming impossible to ignore once darkness settled in. The wheels spoke constantly, a steady rhythm, iron against iron, repeating without pause. At first, it was sharp and intrusive, but over time it blended into a continuous murmur, a mechanical heartbeat beneath the floor. Some found it unbearable, others, unexpectedly, found it soothing. Wooden carriages added their own voices. Walls creaked, beams groaned gently with every curve of the track. The train seemed to breathe, stretch, and complain as it moved through the night. It felt less like a machine and more like a living thing carrying its passengers forward. Smells lingered heavily. Oil from the lamps mixed with coal smoke drifting in through open vents. Damp wool, unwashed bodies, tobacco, and food carried from home blended into a dense, stagnant air. By morning, the scent clung to clothes and hair, traveling with passengers long after they stepped off the train. Ventilation offered no real relief. Opening a window invited sparks, soot, and freezing air. Closing it trapped warmth and breath. Every choice came with discomfort. Sleep in such an environment was never deep. Dreams were thin and easily broken. A sudden whistle, a sharp jolt, or a loud snore could pull the mind back to wakefulness without warning. And yet, within this mixture of noise and scent, people slowly learned to rest. The body adjusted, the senses dulled. The night train became familiar, not pleasant, but known. It was in these conditions that a strange truth emerged. Comfort was not only about softness or silence, it was about acceptance. And once acceptance arrived, sleep followed, however imperfectly. If summer nights were difficult, winter transformed night travel into something far more severe. Cold was no longer an inconvenience, it was a threat. Early railway carriages were little more than wooden shells. Gaps between boards allowed wind to slip inside. Windows held only a single pane of glass, offering almost no protection from freezing air. As the train moved faster, the cold seemed to press harder, finding every weakness. At first, railway companies offered no heating at all. Passengers were expected to rely on coats, scarves, and endurance. This worked poorly. On long winter journeys, fingers numbed, breath became visible, and sleep turned into half-shivering consciousness. Only after serious incidents did change begin. Passengers arrived with frostbitten hands and faces. Some fell ill days later. Complaints reached newspapers and authorities. The night train could no longer ignore winter. The earliest solution was simple: Iron stoves placed inside the carriage. They burned coal or wood and radiated uneven heat. Those seated nearby suffered stifling warmth. Those farther away remained cold. Sparks escaped. Floors smoldered. Fires were rare but feared. Despite the danger, warmth mattered more than safety. Passengers learned new habits. Hot bricks wrapped in cloth were placed beneath feet. Metal flasks filled with boiling water were pressed against the body. Heavy fur blankets became treasured possessions. People layered clothing, wrapped heads, and slept fully dressed. Windows frosted over from the inside. Moist breath froze into delicate patterns, sealing the night outside. By morning, clothes felt damp. Hair smelled of smoke. Bones ached from cold and stiffness. Yet even here, people adapted. Winter nights taught travelers patience and preparation. They learned that the railway did not care for comfort, only movement. Survival depended on understanding that truth and responding to it calmly. And slowly, with each passing season, engineers and companies began to listen, because winter made one thing undeniable. If night travel was to continue, it had to change. Winter did more than make night travel uncomfortable. It forced the railway to evolve. There came a point when endurance was no longer enough. Too many passengers arrived exhausted, ill, or injured by the cold. Complaints became impossible to ignore. In some countries, authorities stepped in. Regulations were issued demanding that passenger cars be heated during winter months. The railway, once a symbol of progress, could not afford to appear careless with human life. Engineers searched for safer solutions. Stoves improved slowly. Metal housings became sturdier. Chimneys were reinforced. Conductors were trained to manage heat more carefully. The danger remained, but it lessened. In other places, experiments began. Steam from the locomotive itself was redirected through pipes running beneath the floors or along the walls of carriages. The system was unreliable at first. Valves failed, pressure dropped, but it offered something new, more even warmth without open flame. Passengers noticed the difference immediately. A carriage that held warmth evenly changed the night entirely. People slept longer. Shivering eased. Muscles relaxed instead of tightening against cold. The railway became less hostile, more tolerable. Preparation also became routine. Winter travelers packed with intention. Extra blankets, woolen undergarments, thermoses, and hot stones. The night train demanded respect, and those who gave it suffered less. Cold, once the greatest enemy of sleep, became manageable. These changes marked an important shift. The railway was no longer asking passengers to endure. It was beginning, slowly, imperfectly, to meet them halfway. And with warmth came a new question. If the night could be survived, could it one day be made comfortable? Once warmth became more reliable, passengers began to notice something unexpected. The night no longer felt like a battle from beginning to end. There were moments, brief, fragile moments, when the body relaxed, and in those moments a new thought quietly appeared. What if the night train did not have to be endured at all? Until then, railway travel had been built around movement, not rest. Seats were for sitting. Nights were something to survive. Comfort was considered unnecessary, even indulgent, but experience was slowly changing that belief. Passengers who arrived less exhausted traveled more often. They complained less. They paid more willingly. Railway companies, always attentive to profit, began to notice the connection. Small improvements followed. Seats gained backs. Backs gained a slight angle. Lighting became softer in the evening. Curtains appeared, offering a hint of privacy. None of this transformed the night, but each change softened it. People began to talk, quietly at first, about sleeping properly in a train. Not dozing, not collapsing from exhaustion, sleeping. It sounded unreasonable, even improper. Sleeping was something done at home, behind walls, in a bed that did not move, and yet the idea refused to disappear. Passengers dreamed of arriving rested, of waking without pain in the neck or legs, of stepping onto the platform clear-headed, not broken by the journey. The railway had already changed how far people could travel. Now it stood on the edge of changing how they rested. The night was still restless, but the thought of comfort had entered the carriage. And once an idea like that appears, it cannot be put back. The idea itself was simple, almost obvious. If people needed to travel through the night, they needed to lie down. For decades, this thought had been quietly dismissed. Trains were public spaces, beds were private. To mix the two seemed improper, even unsettling. Lying down among strangers felt too intimate, too close to something meant only for the home. Yet practicality has a way of wearing down tradition. Longer routes made sitting through the night unbearable. Business, migration, and expanding cities demanded journeys that could not be completed by day alone. Passengers were no longer curious travelers, they were tired ones. Some railway companies experimented cautiously. Seats were made wider, footrests appeared, curtains were added to divide space visually. These changes helped, but they did not solve the problem. The human body was not meant to sleep sitting upright for 10 or 12 hours. Then someone asked the uncomfortable question out loud: why not beds? The proposal shocked many. Newspapers mocked the idea, critics warned of moral decay, doctors questioned whether sleeping fully stretched in a moving vehicle was safe. Engineers worried about space, balance, and cost. But passengers listened with interest. A bed meant rest. Rest meant dignity, and dignity, once tasted, is difficult to surrender. The railway stood at a crossroads. It could continue asking passengers to endure the night, or it could redesign the night itself. What followed would change travel forever. The first true sleeping cars did not look extraordinary from the outside. They resembled ordinary passenger carriages, long wooden bodies, familiar windows, the same heavy presence on the rails. Nothing about them suggested revolution. Inside, however, everything was different. By day, the carriage appeared almost conventional. Softly upholstered seats faced one another. Lamps gave a warmer, steadier light. The atmosphere felt calmer, more ordered, as if the space itself had been designed to slow the mind. Then evening came. A trained attendant moved quietly through the car, beginning the transformation. Seat backs were lowered and joined, forming a wide lower berth. From the wall above, a second berth folded down on hinges, carefully balanced. What had been seating only hours before became a place to lie down. Clean sheets were spread. Real pillows were placed. Blankets followed. For the first time, passengers were offered something more than endurance. They were offered rest. Heavy curtains were drawn around each berth, creating small private compartments within the shared space. Behind fabric and shadow, travelers could change clothes, stretch out, and close their eyes without being watched. The bed was narrow, the ceiling was low. The train still moved, still rattled, still spoke through the rails, but the body lay flat.
Muscles relaxed in ways they never had before on a night train. Breathing slowed. Sleep, fragile but genuine, arrived sooner. This was not the comfort of home, but it was comfort enough to change expectations. For the first time, the railway was not merely transporting people through the night, it was learning how to carry their sleep with them.
The arrival of sleeping cars did not bring universal applause. Alongside admiration came discomfort, suspicion, and debate. Many people were unsettled by the idea of lying down in a public space, even behind curtains. The railway had crossed an invisible line. Newspapers questioned the morality of it. Church leaders warned that such closeness between strangers could erode social order. Sleeping, they argued, was an act of vulnerability, and vulnerability had no place on a train. Yet those who had spent a night in a sleeping car spoke differently. They arrived less exhausted. They walked more steadily onto the platform. They felt, perhaps for the first time, that the journey had not taken something from them. To calm public concern, railway companies introduced rules. Some sections were reserved for women and families. Attendants were instructed to maintain strict order. Curtains were treated not as decoration, but as boundaries, symbols of respect and separation. Gradually, resistance softened. What once seemed improper began to feel practical. Younger passengers accepted sleeping cars without question. To them, the idea of sitting upright through an entire night felt far stranger than lying down. More importantly, the meaning of sleep itself began to change. Sleep was no longer tied exclusively to home. It became something portable, something that could exist wherever the body felt safe enough to surrender. The sleeping car did more than improve comfort. It quietly reshaped expectations. Night travel was no longer just about arriving somewhere else. It was about arriving intact. When the passengers finally lay down, another kind of work began. Sleeping cars depended on people who did not sleep at all. Attendants, often called porters, moved quietly through the carriage throughout the night. They adjusted curtains, brought extra blankets, answered whispered requests, and kept watch while others rested. Their presence was subtle but constant. A sleeping car was a fragile system. One loud voice, one argument, one careless movement could disturb dozens of people at once. The porter's task was to prevent disorder before it appeared. Behind the curtains, private moments unfolded. Some passengers slept immediately, exhausted by travel. Others lay awake, listening to unfamiliar sounds, thinking about the lives they were leaving behind or the ones waiting ahead. A few stared into darkness, uneasy with rest that came so easily after years of endurance. The porter noticed everything. He knew who preferred an early berth and who stayed awake late, who needed silence, who asked for tea, who woke often and who slept heavily. This quiet knowledge created trust. Passengers felt protected by not walls, but by watchfulness. Toward morning, the rhythm changed again. The train slowed more often. The night light softened. One by one, passengers were gently awakened. Curtains opened. Beds folded away. The carriage returned to its daytime shape. The night dissolved as if it had never existed. But something remained. Because even if the sleep was light, even if dreams were broken by motion, the presence of those who stayed awake had made rest possible. And in that quiet vigilance, the sleeping car found its true foundation. As sleeping cars became common in America, Europe watched with curiosity and hesitation. The idea of dozens of people sleeping in one open space, separated only by curtains, felt unsettling to many Europeans. Privacy, to them, meant walls, doors, and locks. American sleeping cars embraced openness. Curtains offered visual privacy, but not silence. Sounds traveled freely. Snoring, footsteps, whispered conversations, everything was shared. The presence of the porter helped maintain order, but the night remained communal. Europe chose a different path. Instead of curtains, European railways built compartments. Each carriage was divided into small enclosed rooms with doors that could be locked from the inside. By day, these compartments held facing seats. By night, they transformed into beds. This design promised something Americans lacked: isolation. Behind a closed door, passengers could undress without haste, speak freely, and sleep without hearing the entire carriage breathe. For many, this felt safer, calmer, more civilized. Yet this privacy came with its own risks. If you traveled alone, strangers might be placed in your compartment. Once the door closed, there was no easy escape. The night could become uncomfortable in new ways, not from noise, but from proximity. Both systems tried to solve the same problem in opposite ways. America trusted supervision and shared space. Europe trusted separation and locks. Neither was perfect, but together they marked an important truth. Night travel had become normal enough to deserve choices. Sleep on the railway was no longer an experiment. It was a permanent part of modern life. Closed doors brought comfort, but they also brought caution. In 19th-century trains, night never fully erased awareness. Sleep came, but it remained light, alert, ready to break. Compartments felt secure, yet passengers knew they were not alone on the railway. Trains carried merchants, laborers, families, and occasionally thieves. Newspapers warned travelers to guard their belongings carefully, especially at night. Many slept with luggage under their heads. Others tied straps around their wrists and bags, an awkward solution meant to prevent silent theft. Valuables were hidden inside coats or pressed close to the body. Trust was measured, not given freely. Women traveling alone were particularly cautious. They were advised to keep lights dim but not extinguished, to sleep fully dressed, and to lock compartment doors whenever possible. Some railways offered ladies-only compartments, though they were never enough to meet demand. Even in American sleeping cars, with porters on duty, people woke easily. A step in the aisle, the rustle of curtains, a whispered voice, all were enough to pull the mind back from rest. This was not fear in the dramatic sense, it was awareness, the quiet understanding that movement carried risk. Yet something else grew alongside that caution: familiarity. As nights passed without incident, confidence slowly replaced anxiety. The railway proved itself again and again. Sleep lengthened, dreams deepened, vigilance softened. Passengers learned a delicate balance: to rest without surrendering entirely, to trust without forgetting. And in that balance, night travel became sustainable. Morning in a night train arrived quietly, not with bird song or stillness, but with a subtle change in rhythm. The wheels sounded different. The train slowed more often. The body sensed wakefulness before the mind fully understood it. Sleep left behind a strange feeling. Not complete rest, but something close to it. Muscles were stiff. Necks ached slightly.
Yet the deep exhaustion of earlier years was gone. Even imperfect sleep had changed everything. Curtains were drawn back one by one. Passengers sat up carefully, stretching within narrow spaces. In compartments, doors opened, releasing soft morning sounds into the corridor. In open sleeping cars, the shared night dissolved into quiet movement. Attendants passed through gently, announcing approaching stations. Beds folded away, sheets disappeared. Within minutes, the carriage returned to its daytime form, as if the night had been a secret. Outside the windows, life reappeared. Platforms, porters, early workers, smoke rising into pale light. Travelers watched these scenes with calm detachment, already halfway between places. People stepped off the train changed, though few spoke of it. They had slept while moving. They had trusted motion. They had learned that rest did not require stillness, only enough safety to let go. The night train no longer felt like an experiment. It had become routine. And with routine came the possibility of something more than survival.
With time, the night train lost its sense of danger. What once felt unnatural slowly became expected. A new generation grew up knowing the railway not as an experiment, but as part of everyday life. Young travelers no longer feared the darkness beyond the windows. They understood the sounds, the pauses, the steady pull of the rails. The movement that unsettled their parents became background noise, something the body accepted without resistance. People learned how to prepare. They packed with intention, soft blankets, small pillows, familiar objects that signaled rest. Some carried books meant only for night journeys. Others followed quiet routines that helped the mind slow down. Sleep itself changed. It became lighter, but more reliable, less complete than at home, yet no longer a struggle. The body adjusted to motion, learning to float within it rather than fight against it. Accidents still happened. Cold nights still tested endurance, but fear no longer defined the experience. Confidence grew from repetition, from countless safe arrivals at dawn. The railway had done something remarkable. It had taught people to rest in transition, to accept that life could move forward while the body paused. Night travel was no longer a challenge to human limits. It had become part of the rhythm of modern existence. And once night could be trusted, the railway was ready for something greater, not just practicality, but pleasure.
By the end of the 19th century, night travel had changed its meaning. What was once endured out of necessity began to attract those who could choose otherwise. The railway discovered something important. People were willing to pay not just for distance, but for the feeling of the journey itself. Sleeping cars grew quieter. Materials improved. Wood was polished. Upholstery softened. Lamps gave warmer light. Curtains grew heavier, absorbing sound and shadow. The night no longer felt exposed. For the first time, the railway offered atmosphere. Passengers lay in their berths watching darkness slip past the windows. Station lights appeared briefly, then vanished. The world outside became a moving landscape, distant and unreal, while the interior of the train felt enclosed and safe. Sleep came easier here, not deep like at home, but gentle and continuous. The body rocked with the motion instead of resisting it. Dreams blended with the rhythm of travel. The night train became a place of quiet reflection. People read, they wrote letters, they thought about where they were going and why. The journey itself became time set aside from ordinary life, a pause between past and future. Railway companies noticed the change in attitude and leaned into it. Comfort was no longer an accident, it was a feature, a promise. The night train had crossed a final threshold. It was no longer merely transportation. It had become an experience.
Today, sleeping on a train feels ordinary. We board, settle in, close our eyes, and wake somewhere else. The miracle is so familiar that we rarely notice it. But this comfort was earned slowly. It began with wooden benches, cold drafts, and fear of the dark. With passengers who stayed awake through the night, listening to every sound, unsure whether rest was safe. With people who learned, patiently, how to surrender just enough to sleep while the world moved beneath them. The railway taught humanity something new, that rest does not belong only to stillness, that sleep can travel. Over time, iron rails carried not just bodies, but trust. Each safe night softened resistance. Each gentle awakening proved that motion and rest could coexist. Even the most luxurious sleeping cars of the Golden Age were built on that early struggle, on endurance, adaptation, and quiet courage. Perhaps that is why night trains still feel different. They are not quite home and not quite elsewhere. They exist in between, a moving pause, a place where time loosens its grip. And when we fall asleep to the rhythm of wheels, we repeat a story centuries in the making, a story of learning to let go while the world continues forward. May this journey linger gently in your thoughts, and may your own nights, wherever they carry you, be calm. Good night.